I'm going to start because for those of you that have joined some of our learning events, I've got a really bad echo. People go on mute, please. For those of you that have joined our events before, we always fast run out of time. So I'm going to call some of the little introductions and just move you through speaker by speaker, give absolute opportunity for everyone to talk. Chris, can you just send me down a slide, please? I'm not sure if other people got the next slide or if it's me, but you'll see we've got a really packed full, and the next one, please. Packed full agenda for you, hence why I'm not going to take too long now. But if we just go on to the next slide, that's just a little bit of housekeeping. So you'll notice if you can all please keep your cameras off and on mute unless you are the speaker at that point, please then rejoin the meeting with your camera on and off mute, obviously. There's also a chat function within Microsoft Teams. If you've got any questions or comments, please drop it in there. The chat's been really great on these events up to date, and we will aim to either answer your questions during this session or we will send out the answers with the slide deck after this. So you will all get the slides. Please don't worry about that. If for any reason your chat isn't working, you'll see there you've got Jenny's email address. Just keep an eye on her email inbox throughout the course of this session. So if you just drop her an email, we'll be able to pick your questions up that way as well. So a massive thank you to everyone for joining us. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it straight over to Anthony Marsh, who's joined us from both the National Team and West Midlands Ambulance Service to give us an update from a national perspective. Thanks, Anthony. Are you there, Anthony? I'm not sure if you're still on mute. I've seen you. Right, I've got a horrible feeling for some reason we've lost Anthony, which is a shame because I've seen him, so I know he's there, but I just can't find his name now in the screen. So in that case, I'm really sorry to do this to Jim, who's our next speaker, who's come to talk to us. Oh, sorry, is that you, Anthony?
Joined us again, so it might be worth seeing if Anthony can now speak.
Sorry, Anthony, it's over to you if you can hear me.
Yeah. Okay, Charlotte, thanks very much. A lot of feedback today. Can you hear me now, Charlotte?
Yeah, you're clear. I think we've just got a couple of people not on mute. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Sorry about that. The call dropped out for some reason. But Charlotte, listen. Firstly, a big thank you to colleagues for joining today's event. It's a great opportunity to hear from colleagues around the country on what has worked well and what further steps need to be taken as we move into the next phases of this global pandemic and the NHS and the ambulance services response to this national level 4 emergency. And I'd just like to place on record my enormous thanks to ambulance services, both NHS ambulance services and the third sector, right across England.
Hello.
If colleagues could go on to mute, that would be enormously helpful, please. I'd just like to place on record my enormous thanks to all ambulance services, NHS ambulance services and third-party ambulance services for the tremendous way in which they've stepped forward in dealing with this emergency and keeping our patients safe and ensuring that we've been able to convey those patients that needed to be conveyed for their ongoing treatment. It's been really appreciated from a national level. And of course, that hard work, professionalism and commitment is going to continue to be required over the next few months as we move into the next phase. But just to say a couple of things. Firstly, the way in which PTS have stepped forward, particularly ensuring that we've been able to use PTS staff in some parts of the country to underpin and to increase capacity on the emergency service, supporting the frontline emergency service by maybe conveying patients, urgent patients, to hospital that's freed up emergency paramedic crews to be able to deal with emergency 999 calls with those PTS staff undertaking additional training. So again, really big thanks to PTS staff for taking on that role. Also for the voluntary sector, in particular the St John Ambulance, for the way in which they've stepped up, supporting both the emergency service across the country, but also PTS services in most, if not all, of the regions across England as well. We couldn't have done this. The NHS wouldn't have been able to do such a fantastic job that it has done, including the ambulance services right across the country. We wouldn't have been able to have done that and to have achieved so much for our patients without the enormous support and the ongoing hard work of our St John Ambulance volunteers as well. And when I look at some of the performance of PTS providers across England, the speed by which they're collecting discharges from acute hospitals to be able to maintain that flow so that we can support prompt handovers at the front door in the emergency departments, good, safe flow through the hospitals, including social distancing in hospitals, is going to be increasingly important as we move into phase 2 of the NHS response and the restoration of critical services, where we will see PTS activity increasing. It's really important that we hold on to the things which have worked really well and that we maintain our grip on the excellent services that we've been able to provide for all of our patients in an environment where PPE is going to be continually important for our staff, to protect our staff, because without the sufficient staff on duty, we won't be able to provide the essential services for all of our PTS patients, and also recognising the impact of social distancing both for staff and for patients. So traditionally in ambulances that might have been able to convey 5 or 6 or maybe even more patients in one run, that will no longer be possible in order to ensure that we fulfil the social distancing rules to keep staff and patients safe. And then the final thing I wanted to draw out, Charlotte, is in relation to the winter. At this time of the year, we review what worked well last winter, perhaps what needs to be improved for this winter going forward. And of course, this winter we know different. There are always 3 unknowns. What will the weather do to us? The levels of seasonal influenza and levels of norovirus. And last year, the weather was generally kind to most of us across the country. Seasonal influenza was high. I think it was the highest levels that we'd had for about 10 years in Q3, back end of last year. Norovirus was a bit higher than the seasonal average as well. What we don't know, of course, are the answer to those 3 risks this year, but also the added level of risk and uncertainty, ambiguity around COVID-19 as well. So it's really important that our winter plans this year are the best they've ever been, the strongest they've ever been, the most comprehensive that they've ever been, building on the things which have worked well over the last 3 or 4 months, building on the things which have served the NHS and served our patients well over previous winters, so that we're in the best possible place as we go into this coming winter. So again, a really big thank you to all of you for what you've done with your NHS Ambulance Services, third sector commissioners and other colleagues from the NHS. We really do very much appreciate everything you've done and everything you continue to do. Charlotte, I'm going to stop there, but happy to take any questions either now or separately, depending on how you want to progress. Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. That was great. Yes, it could be a very interesting winter this year. So I think it's prepare, which we've heard from some of our presentations on other ones of these. So definitely. In terms of questions, we'll do them either at the end if we've got time, or we'll pick up with you separately if that's okay, just in the interest of getting all the speakers on today. So I'm now going to hand over. So Jim Britt has joined us from Cheshire, so just over the border from the Midlands, again to talk to us about his learning from COVID around eligibility criteria. So over to you. Thanks, Jim. If you can come off mute and put your camera on. Cheers.
Hi, and good afternoon, everybody. And I am the lead commissioner as well as head of urgent care for Cheshire, Warrington and Wirral. So as such, I'm a commissioner customer of Anthony's West Midlands ambulance service. So this is particularly potent. Also, I feel slightly as of this is not so much learning as of COVID, but I think it's a lesson to be maybe post-COVID. We had could I have the next slide, please, Chris? Okay. We had a big issue. We could not get to the bottom of this. We were looking at the activity and financial reports for our PTS service from WUMAS, and it was very erratic month on month, not just within CCGs, but between CCGs, of which there were 6. No discernible explanation, and to top it all, and to give us the incentive, we had a QUIP program, an imposed target of a combined value of about £500,000. So there was a big incentive to try and get to the bottom of this. Next slide, please. So what are our objectives? Really, we were looking at not so much genuinely eligible patients. The last thing we wanted to do was actually prejudice them. We didn't want to exclude people if they generally needed the transport. But once eligibility is confirmed, we wanted to get to a much better assessment of the type of transport that they needed according to the patient's clinical need. This was something which was obviously going wrong at that initial stage when the patient is calling for transport, and it sounds very simple to solve. Next slide, please. So what did we do? Well, what we decided to do was refresh the eligibility and clinical assessment telephony scripts. Obviously, all these calls go through a call centre, that in this case through Tollgate down in Stafford. And we obviously spent some time preparing those scripts and testing them.
Everyone is doing very well. I wanted to just...
Hello?
Sorry about that, Jim. I think someone's knocked themselves off mute. If you could please stay on mute, that would be great. Thanks, Jim.
Okay, well, just no problem. So we obviously had to introduce and train the call centre staff on the new scripts. They weren't completely new. What we did was refresh them and really sharpen them up. And it took quite a long time to get to that. And it probably took a month as well to get the call centre staff up and running with the new approach, so that you can see the timeline, September last year through to January 2020. And we were obviously looking to monitor and measure any improvements and trends from then onwards. The other big deal, and we couldn't have done this without this, was a quality impact assessment. In other words, were we prejudicing any of the patients that use our service? Were they actually being disenfranchised, or were we basically giving them the wrong answers or wrong transport? So the QIA was very key to this, and we set out that from the outset. Next slide, please, Chris. And what were the results? The refresh scripts went live over September, October 2019. The WUMAS Cleric patient admin system required reprogramming, and that in itself was quite a challenge to actually get that done and get it done in a particularly logical way. And over that initial period, there was quite a lot of fine tuning, and also we were looking for feedback from the call handlers, and we had quite a lot of that. Very helpful staff, very helpful staff at Tollgate. So they were identifying issues, and we were doing quite a lot of fine tuning. I spent several visits and so quite a lot of time down at Tollgate in Stafford as a result. And then we were looking at the results, the activity and financial data which we were receiving as part of the contract from WUMAS, to see if we've actually made any difference. The data analysis really started in earnest from November through December, so not a lot to go on really. And the other element was the CCG analysis in terms of patient experience. In other words, were we getting more complaints or indeed more compliments? Were there any signs that what we were doing was really affecting people in an adverse way? So that was another key element of the QIA really. Next slide, please. So our conclusion, this is all very brief, and I'm sorry it's also rushed, but 5 minutes isn't very long. So the initial results were very promising indeed, but they were over December, and we'll all know that really December is not a typical month. And then the January results came in and a bit inconclusive. They look really reasonably positive, but inconclusive really. And of course, what you really want to do is to run this and test it over probably 3, if not 6 months, to get a really distinct result, something that you can see that you've achieved. But then COVID struck. So although we needed further analyses, COVID actually more or less stopped us in our tracks, and everything changed, as we all know. So that was to some extent disappointing, and if we ever do get back to anything like normality, we'll probably pick this up and start it again. But the QIA that we looked at, there was no rise in eligibility appeals, so genuine patients were not jeopardised, and there was some evidence that assessment of a patient's mobility is now much more consistent, and that's the really key result from this, making sure that whatever the clinical need of the patient, they had an appropriate allocation of transport, because that obviously wasn't happening before. And I think finally, I can't quite see my last line. Yes, it's too early to say that this has been a big success. And of course, with the advent of COVID, and we're into a new financial year, there is no big quip pressure either. So the pressure is off us in terms of saving money. I think that's the last. Oh, there's one more slide, isn't there, Chris? Yes. This is what really got us excited. You can see the November to December, the right-hand side of this, actual versus plan, made us very excited. You can see that pretty much we thought, right, we're on the right track here, and then we had to stop looking at the analysis. And the last slide, Chris. So lessons learned, the new environment. Post-coronavirus world will be different for PTS. Well, we know that. It's a statement of the obvious. We will re-examine the data and start again. The original quit objectives were shelved, but we are still trying to save money as a set of CCGs, so I think that will come back. We had originally 6 CCGs, now only 3, because we have the newly merged Cheshire CCG, which means there's only 3, but one of them is very large. And the focus on effective assessment of modality, it was the key to efficiency in our minds. And we've got another 3.5 years of the WUMAS contract to run. So in all, we thought we got off to a roaring start, but unfortunately it really came to a halt with the advent of COVID, and really everything's been different. But we'll have to revisit this maybe next spring. We don't really know when, but we will revisit it. So that's thanks. It'd be great if there's anyone wants to ask questions or come back to me later.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, there's nothing in the chat at the minute, so we'll hold questions to the end. But I mean, really interesting, and actually what a great way as we go into the requirements around social distancing, etc., that eligibility will be so important, that only the right people are getting the right transport. So that was really, really interesting. Thank you. And please, if anybody's got any questions for Jim, just drop them in the chat and we'll make sure we get a response to you. Yeah. And oh yeah, there's a question in there, Jim, if you wouldn't mind going over to the chat, that'd be great. And now, very timely, actually, I'm going to hand over to Simon Smith from ERS Medical, who's going to talk to us how they use Microsoft Teams to optimise communication. And I guess this event's a great example of that too. So over to you. Thanks, Simon. If you can put your camera and your microphone on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. Next slide, please. So ERS Medical is a private ambulance provider providing contracted services to the NHS across multiple locations within the UK. Next slide, please. It was really, really important during the initial stages of COVID-19 for us to oversee all of our operations, and information was key to this. And so we instigated various methods to do that: weekly meetings for the COVID-19 Senior Leadership Committee, weekly head of meetings, and various daily meetings throughout sites across the UK. We also did internal communications through letters from our managing director, clinical memos to all staff, and various other things like toolbox talks and senior leadership staff meetings, which is the main thrust of my 5 minutes. We also did external communications quite robustly and early. We did weekly Independent Ambulance Association directors calls, bi-weekly MD letters to external stakeholders, and regular updates to both the CQC and to ambulance trusts. Next slide, please. So our Managing Director, Mr. Andrew Pooley, set out 3 themes for us within the letter dated the 10th of March, for us to be responsive, measured, clear and transparent. And that was key to our thrust and the way that we wanted to manage our communication. Next slide, please. So very early, we recognised that we needed to be robust and open in communication. It was, of course, needed both externally and externally, like I've already said, and we recognised that staff fear and anxiety, especially in the early stages of COVID-19, was going to be a potential issue for us. Adding to this confusion, not just within our own organisation, were different messages coming across from the press and other providers, both private and in the NHS. Next slide, please. So some of the local communication methods we used, obviously we would still continue to use our one-to-one with site managers, and we had an open door process. We had various clinical and governance updates aligned to the guidance from Public Health England and NHS England. We continue to operate a robust clinical on-call service 24/7 and used internal communications through Site TV, our in-house magazine, and predominantly as well Microsoft Teams, which is what we're using now. Next slide, please. So the senior leadership of ERS Medical set up a series of Microsoft Teams virtual site meetings so that we could thank our staff for their outstanding efforts across the whole of their operations, and they were working in unprecedented times. We advertised these meetings well in advance and timed them to try and allow maximum attendance by staff at sites, whilst obviously trying to retain 2-metre social distancing. We supplied additional IT equipment to all of our sites to enable them to set up these meetings virtually. And we asked the local operations managers to canvass staff in advance of the meetings so we could have a bank of questions and have answers available. But we did also encourage on-the-day questions as well. Next slide, please. So we arranged approximately 21 site meetings over 4 distinct operational regions, from Fife to Scotland and down to Eastleigh in the south of England. We received 41 separate lines of questioning into our meetings, and obviously there were more questions in this, but there was duplications across regions and across sites. Questions were very, very wide-ranging, from concerns about PPE, what would happen to staff if they had to isolate, shielding, pay, leave, testing, and sickness terms and conditions. And the issue with the PPE one, which is probably the one that came up the most, was the differences in PPE between different organisations and different clinical staff, and the confusion that that potentially generated amongst ambulance crews, especially those of non-emergency, when they saw their paramedic colleagues in level 3 PPE and they were in level 2 PPE. So these meetings presented an ideal opportunity for us to allay some of those fears and just reinforce the message from Public Health England about the level 2 PPE.
Simon, can I just give you a 1-minute warning, please?
Absolutely. Once meetings had all been collated, we brought together a Q&A session, and this was distributed and sent out to all staff members. And generally the meetings were very well received at all levels. Next slide, please. So here's some screenshots of our senior leadership team virtual meetings. I do apologise, I do appear to be in 2 of these, but you can see that they've got staff there in all of these pictures, reading from Durham, Blythe, Mansfield, Mitcham, down in London. And on the average, each meeting lasted approximately about an hour, and started off with our MD, Andrew Pooley, giving a nice introduction, thanking the staff, as I've already said. And it was just a really, really good way of breaking down barriers and allowing the teams to see us and ask us face-to-face questions, whilst maintaining everything we needed to do for social distancing. That's about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon. That's really great. And I think one of the big things we've learned through all these events is the fantastic work that's gone into making sure staff are well communicated to and engaged throughout what's obviously been a challenge for everyone. So thank you. That was really, really interesting. So I'm now going to hand over to David, and David joins us from Mids and Lancs CSU. And he's going to talk around some of the lack of commissioning framework when it comes to PTS contracting. So David, if you could put your camera and microphone on, I'll pass to you. Thank you.
Hi everybody. Just a quick update on myself, I suppose. So I currently work as a senior contract manager for Midlands NHSE CSU. One of the contracts I look after is the PTS contract. I've also working in commissioning as well with the PTS contract at the moment. Prior to this, I actually worked for a PTS provider, so I could say I've been on both sides of the fence when it comes to non-emergency patient transport. What I wanted to do in my first slide is just show you what I believe providers and commissioners could learn from the current, the ongoing COVID pandemic, and before I move on to the commissioning framework. So these are some of the key elements that I think that my colleagues in commissioning and the provider we've worked with have learned. I won't go into a great detail on all of them, but communication, I think we've had more communication over this last few months than we've ever had before. And we find that actually our communication lines do need to be improved. We need to be more focused on sharing messages with each other, whether that's good or bad, so we can enable the smooth running of the service. Risk awareness, that's been a massive part of what's been going on in the last few months. Working together to get those risks identified and ensuring that we work on resolving those risks so they don't affect the patient, the quality of the patient journey. Problem solving is linked to that risk awareness. No blame culture, which I feel is very important in the time of pandemic, because it's all about getting this job done, ensuring that the patients are conveyed safely and on time. Joint working, the gain and pain sharing, I call it. So there's those sorts of aspects where actually there is going to be a bit of an issue. We need to resolve those issues and work through it. Mutual objectives, we're all aiming for the same thing, and we need to realise that sometimes. Performance measurement. So although the standard performance metrics haven't been utilised during this period, we've been looking at measuring the performance so we can identify the gaps and support each other. And then obviously continuous improvements. And I think that's very key moving forward in terms of the coming out of COVID-19 and a changing landscape. So moving on now to the next steps. For many years now, I've thought about, next slide please, sorry. I've thought about for a while, many years. I felt that the non-emergency patient transport service has been overlooked slightly in terms of its importance to the actual NHS health economy in all areas. And I think its importance has shone through in terms of this COVID pandemic and how important it is. What I've done is worked in several areas along the West Midlands and also down south, and I've seen the variations in specifications, the variations in KPIs that are quite commonplace all over the country, and it's a highly competitive market. So when the CCGs are building their modelling and they want their KPIs, we've got a raft of people coming in with lots of knowledge and lots of ideas, but the KPIs are completely different throughout the country. The specifications are, so you never get one aligned model in the whole of the country. I think a commissioning framework, when I was discussing this with colleagues, would enable it to be a simple and effective guide to supporting the commissioners in reducing the variations for NEPs, and it would encourage a more collaborative approach between the regions, between the border counties, between the CCGs, because after all, our sole goal is delivering the best outcomes for patients. I think the framework can be used when commissioning, and we still follow the standard contract, and we just need a national PTS specification. Also, I'm aware that each individual area may have some local variations, like we do with the ambulance service. There are some variations to that, but it still follows a national framework. And it's also worth noting, as the STPs and ICS is developed, that new commissioning landscape will be forthcoming, and there could be no better opportunity to deliver this. Next slide, please. So the benefits of a commissioning framework: improved patient journey, reduction on variation in service delivery and quality, a shared vision and strategy for NEPs across the country, a consistent commissioning process and sharing of best practice, sustainable services, so we're ensuring that all providers are able to meet the requirements of the services, eradicating the inefficiencies that we see from service to service, national performance, clinical and quality targets, so we're able to look at how everyone in the country is performing, again, a bit like the emergency services. And then obviously the national PTS specification, which takes some of the onerous work that's done by commissioners in terms of developing a specification that's completely unique to their area, when in fairness, it doesn't always need to be that way. Next slide, please.
Just give you a minute warning. Sorry, I know it goes so quick.
No problem. So this is what I believe the commissioning priority expectation should be. Commissioners should be looking at commissioning a NEP service and ensure it's done to national standards, ensuring the improving patient journey is the heart of decisions, ensuring NEPs providers are an integral part of the system planning. That's a big key thing for me, making sure that they are part of the planning, ensuring roles and responsibilities are defined. In terms of the provider, delivering the service in line with the set standards, maintaining the focus, commitment to implement and deliver an effective and efficient model in line with changes in demand, and that's quite key, especially as we change. Collaborate, integrate and engage with everybody, key partners, acute hospitals, be open and transparent in respect to service delivery and performance. And it's just all about collaboration, but I think we all need a bit of a help. We need a national standard and a national specification to work to, and we've seen the successes of our 9 services falling under that same sort of setup, and I think it's time that the NEP service also fell into that as well. And I think that's it from me.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. I'm not going to do lots of spiel because you were all here to listen to everyone else, not me. So I'm going to pass us over now to Joy, who's joined us from EMAS and is going to talk about integrated working between NHS and non-NHS providers. So that's really great. Joy, if you can turn your camera on and come off mute, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Charlotte. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be part of today's event and to be sharing our experience with you all around integrated working between NHS and non-NHS PTS providers as part of our response to COVID-19. So first slide, please. So I'm sure, as most of you are aware, on the 27th of March, there was a national request for NHS Ambulance Trust to undertake a lead role within each of their geographical regions, providing a single point of contact to support individual system-wide discharge teams who are also working in line with the National Discharge Service requirements. Next slide, please. So as you can see on the slide, within the East Midlands region, there's 3 ambulance services providing a PTS provision. So ourselves as an NHS trust and 2 non-NHS providers, and that was ERS Medical and Thames Ambulance Service. So on receipt of the guidance at EMAS, we had an internal discussion to establish what was required of us as the NHS Trust for the East Midlands, what was required to make this ask work. And for us, part of that was to plan a new booking process, a new communication strategy. So lots of things that we had in mind. We concluded our discussions knowing exactly how it was going to work and just needed to plan how to implement the process with ERS and Thames. It was that simple to us. Well, as most things in life, and as I found, I'm sure everybody's found, notably during the pandemic, is that it didn't turn out to be quite that simple. So it was evident from our first discussions as a group that we all initially interpreted the ask in a slightly different way, and that most of our organisation's processes were undertaken differently too, and that just relates to just what's been talked about around having that framework that everybody's commissioned slightly differently. So it was also identified as well that re-educating the discharge teams to book differently, whilst they were also managing their own internal challenges and changes in process, would be an added risk to the system. So what was clear from those early discussions and the new views that we'd shared was that we're jointly going to find a new model that would work to deliver the positive response for system partners and patients within our region. We just needed to revisit our original strategy. So we developed a final model quite quickly. And if I remember right, I think it was by the second or third telephone call at the latest. So the openness and support from ERS and TEMS was there from the beginning, and just actually want to take this opportunity to thank them for that. It was through all organisations' willingness really to be flexible during a time that, you know, everybody needed to put the commercial nature of PTS aside and to support each other in a crisis that actually made this happen. So next slide, please. So within 12 calendar days, if I've done my maths correctly, we'd jointly undertaken the 9 key actions that I've put on the slide and went live on the 9th of April. So with the discharge coordination team and reporting to NHSE, which I feel really was quite incredible. And it's also been a great opportunity for the operational teams to get to know each other. And usually mutual aid between NHS trusts is long-standing and the norm. But I don't see why not following this exercise that it should be any different with non-NHS providers, and hope that the positivity and the trust building from this joint piece of work helps to support the relationships to grow for the future. And in particular this winter, as Anthony alluded to at the beginning, it's such an unknown, so hopefully it prepares us for the future outside of the pandemic as well. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Great to hear about the providers coming together and a lot of enthusiasm there. So really positive. I'm now going to run us over to Keith Pryor, who's joined us from the National Ambulance Resilience Unit, to give us some more national overview following on from Anthony earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Keith Pryor. I'm the Director of the National Ambulance Resilience Unit. One of the functions of the National Ambulance Resilience Unit, amongst many, is the management of the National Ambulance Coordination Centre. Thank you. Now, what is the National Ambulance Coordination Centre? If you can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the NAC is an office based in the headquarters at West Midlands Ambulance Service. It's actually been stood up since mid-November. No, we didn't have foresight of COVID back in November. We were set up for winter. And it carried on running through winter into the floods, if you remember that far back, that many parts of the country had, and through into COVID. And what is the NAC? What is it there for? Well, it's to provide strong leadership, organisation and coordination with clear lines of communication between individual ambulance trusts, and to provide a conduit between those ambulance services, highlighting problems and disseminating agreed tactical solutions. Now, that's quite a mouthful. What does it mean? If we can move on to the next slide, please. It means that we collate information, we interpret information, and we disseminate that information out to the trust. Now, that information is not just A&E information. That's information right across the whole spectrum, and that includes A&E. That includes hazardous area response teams. It includes most definitely PTS information. Information from the voluntary sector and the independent sector. And we can just move on again, please. Thank you. That information is then fed up through to the National Ambulance Strategic Advisor, and that's who is Anthony, who spoke earlier. And that is key to the decision making that he makes on a national basis every single day. Move on again, please. And some of those things that have been highlighted and supported by the NAC include escalating PPE issues, coordinating the military aid to the civil agency, MACA requests, and such like. We can just move across again, and it's really important that we kept those staff safe in that room as well. Quite a small room. Really important that as we ramped up through COVID, put more people in there that we manage in a safe way. Some of the challenges that we've had, as you would expect, culture is always an issue whenever something new is in place. Getting that information from trusts and getting them to understand that it's vital that we get the information on time, so the processes needed to be right. We had to handball a lot of information into the national SIT rep and the national database that we manage, you know, some of the information was clearly incorrect or been interpreted incorrectly. Moving ahead into the positives, you know, I could put the same things down for positives. The culture was changed. We're now getting that information through. We're supporting trust with the information, and Anthony's been able to make those decisions. The process is much more smooth. Technological solutions for some of the issues have been brought in very, very quickly. And of course, that data is now really smooth and running really well. We can just move on again. Thank you. I think it's really important that we understand that throughout this emergency, PTS has provided a very clear and important role, and that contribution has been vital to ensuring that the ambulance service has met the challenges as we go forward. If we just go forward again, thank you. Just on a final note then, I've had almost final confirmation. I think it was probably fair to say that the NAC will continue operating right through the winter and through to the early part of spring next year. So we're there to support you. We're there to support Anthony in his role, and we're there to support everybody involved. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith, and yes, we'll look forward to continuing to work with you into the winter. So I'm going to hand over very quickly to Hereford and Worcester, and Duncan's coming to talk about late day discharges, which I think are a frustration for many of us on this call. So if you can put your camera on and come off mute, Duncan, that'd be lovely, and try and keep to 5 minutes. Thanks.
Hi, yes, I'm on a very wobbly connection here, so I'm going to avoid the video because it keeps on bouncing me out. So if you can go on to the first slide, please. There was a general assumption that the cancellation of routine procedures would give us enough capacity in the service to transport high priority patients and COVID cases. And there are a number of reasons why this is not the case. I should point out at this point that this presentation is very much focused on lessons learned. There's been an awful lot of very good work on the ground in Herefordshire and Worcestershire, but I want to bring this around issues which we can learn from and hopefully move towards some form of result. So our first problem was that none of our vehicles were fitted with bulkheads. It took us around 2 weeks to get the work completed, and this required us to commission a variety of third-party providers at very short notice. Everybody knows about the PPE issue. From our point of view, our provider stockpiles 3 months worth of PPE under normal circumstances, but as soon as we entered into crisis mode, that ran out in a matter of days. The next point is the single patient transfers have been extremely problematic in terms of capacity to meet demand. It's caused a number of problems in trying to stretch the fleet, which again, under normal circumstances would have been absolutely fine. Staff shortages again, inevitably as a result of drivers coming into contact with people that they thought that may have been infected and were required to self-isolate. That pushed us into staff shortage situation. Our provider carries a very large bank, which under normal circumstances means that this is never an issue. But as I guess you all know, many bank drivers are retired and are therefore, by definition, a high-risk group themselves. And this meant that many of them were unwilling to work, which again was something which was unforeseen. Could you go on to the next slide, please? Next, can you hear me?
Yes, Duncan, we can hear you.
Can you Can you go on to the next slide, please?
There you go. It's just a delay. It's come up now.
Oh, no, okay. Not here, it hasn't.
Oh, it's changed for us, I'm afraid. It might be your connection.
But you can you see the next slide?
We can see it, yeah.
Okay, so the stresses that existed in the system were compounded by the new restraints. Some trusts, of course, are a lot better than others when it comes to managing discharge planning. But on-the-day bookings have been an ongoing problem for us generically. Linked to this, on-the-day bookings often come in surges, which is particularly... Hello, am I still online?
Yeah, you are. Someone's just joined. They weren't on mute. They've gone onto mute now. Yeah, carry on, Duncan, please. Duncan, are you still with us? Okay, I think sadly we've lost Duncan, so we'll move across to St John's Ambulance. So Dan and Craig, I think, are doing a double act for us on mobilising the St John's resource. If you're both able to join, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting us to come and talk to you this afternoon. Dan is in the office with me, but obviously because of social distancing, he can't fit into my camera, but he is here and we'll be happy to answer questions at the end together. So in St John, we've been responding to emergencies for over 140 years, and as the leading health charity in England, we are uniquely placed to be able to mobilise large numbers of people to support our communities and indeed the NHS. In fact, COVID-19 has been our biggest ever operation as St John, actually bigger than the operations we provided during the World War. So we've now delivered 100,000 patient-facing hours, and behind all of those patient-facing hours are thousands of other hours of people that are making sure that our vehicles are ready and that our people are in the right place and that our people are well trained to do the tasks that we ask them to do. We have a year-round relationship with NHS England, both locally and obviously in the centre, and we really value the relationship that we have with our NHS ambulance partners. And we've worked really closely with Anthony Marsh and the national team, and our efforts have been enabled because of their support of us to make things happen much easier. So we've not experienced issues with PPE, and we've been able to tailor our response based on the national demand portfolio, making sure that our response gets the sort of the most benefit for people in our communities. So that meant, in fact, that actually a lot of support was provided in the London region, us moving our people from around the country to support London and the London Ambulance Service, who were obviously 2 weeks ahead of the rest of the country. But as things have started to settle, we've been able to work with Anthony and indeed the National Ambulance Resilient Unit to make sure that our people are in the right place. We moved into 24/7 command and control arrangements, as you'd expect, and as you'd have been subject to yourselves. That's meant that we've worked from 4 regional control centres with a national joint operational command hub, which is based in London, which supports our strategic and national tactical commanders. In addition to that, we operate actually from quite a big estate, and as part of our operations, we've actually moved to 33 national ambulance hubs, meaning that we can make sure that all of our equipment is made ready and all of our people are ready and are able to be deployed across the country. So what's that meant? Actually, we've now delivered just over, in terms of just the ambulance service alone, we've delivered 34,641 hours of ambulance support, working really closely, both in our response to 999 calls, but in addition to 999, we operate clearly an emergency as well as an urgent and non-emergency patient transport service. That's 2,787 individual ambulance deployments. with over 8,000 patients treated, with over 5,000 of them being treated and in collaboration with clinical hubs in NHS Trust being able to be safely discharged at home, reducing obviously pressures on the emergency departments, and that's a fantastic achievement. Moving forward, we will continue to work with Anthony and the national team to make sure that our people are in the right place to continue providing care, and we're really keen to support local winter plans, and we're really encouraging commissioners and others to work with us at this early stage as we move into what will, I know it feels like we say, don't we? I've worked in the NHS for 17 years. This is my first non-NHS role, and every year I feel like I'm told that this is going to be sort of the most difficult winter, but there really is a need for us all to work really closely together to make sure that we have really robust plans and arrangements in place to make sure that we can not only meet the needs of winter, but the likely effect that COVID will continue to have as we go through those difficult months. We're really proud to be rated as a good organisation by the CQC. We really drive standards in the organisation to make sure that patients get the best experience and the best outcomes. And we opted not to pull lots of slides together, but in the slide deck that will be shared after this meeting will be a really detailed report about our operation just in April and about how we mobilised that response. So you'll be able to click onto that. I don't expect you to do that now. In fact, it probably won't work now in Teams, but you'll be able to click onto that and understand the detail of our response in April alone, and we will happily have conversations about our response in your areas and in your communities in winter moving forwards. But I'll pause there, and as others are happy to take questions, or I'll respond to questions in the chat at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. And there are some questions in the chat. I know people have just commented about Duncan's dropping out. We will get the slides and perhaps some narrative attached. We're just trying to relocate him, so apologies for that. Really great there from St John's. A huge thank you for all that the voluntary sector do. That includes other partners as well, but it's great to have you back with us today. And I'm now going to hand over to Michelle Brotherton from West Mids Ambulance Service, and I'll let Michelle chat through her presentation. If you can put your camera on and come off mute, Michelle, that'd be great.
Thank you, Charlotte. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so from our PTS response, our initial scenario, we were faced with, obviously, PTS initially weren't transporting positive patients. As we got through sort of like, the middle of March, we started to see, obviously, the impact on the PTS service, as the 999 service of COVID-19, which meant for all of us, our abstraction rate, absolutely went really through the sky. So ours was around 14% initially from a PTS perspective. What was really important was around the engagement with the commissioners and the acutes and the community trusts, and working through this together to ensure that those patients that absolutely needed to come into hospital were focused on initially. So that's renals, the cancers, the timeliness of the discharges, and anybody else where a clinician said that there was a clinical need for that patient to come in. We strive with our discharges, following on from our winter modelling, of achieving 100% within 2 hours, and also working 85% within an hour. Next slide, please. So in terms of our priorities, we're very clear, and that was around the patient safety, both protecting our 999 service and our PTS essential service, our staff safety, PPE provision, the essential services from a PTS perspective, absolutely maximising our resources, both in our staff and our ambulances, and the achievement of all of our KPIs, and across all of our contracts from a West Midlands perspective, and we provide for Cheshire as well. That's around 74 KPIs, which have been achieved throughout. Next slide, please. So in terms of our operating model, working on the good practice that we've had over the last few years with the winter, we continued with our tactical officer working alongside in our emergency control room at Brierley Hill, where they had strategic overview of discharges, working with the hospital desk on the front door activity and then also the back door activity for the timeliness of discharges, and making sure that we're prioritising those crews for those areas. We absolutely maximise our use of our discharge coordinators, ensuring the timeliness of the booking check-ins, ensuring that TTOs were ready, also the porters as well. So we were able to, crews were able to drop off patients, utilising the porters to take them to the wards. So to ensure that we were reducing our downtime and getting our crews out on the road quicker. Renal coordinators again had a real key part to play. Actually, 50% of our contracts are renal patients, and they were absolutely in that essential services. So a lot of work in collaboration with our renal departments and ensuring that we're changing times, making sure with the social distancing that those patients obviously got into all of their appointments on time. Home working as well, those members of staff who could work from home did. Some of our staff who were shielding as well continued to work from home, especially where they had an EOP function, so we were able to set them up at home for planning and taking call taking, etc. Next slide, please. So we had a 40% reduction in activity, as I've already alluded to, focus on rapid discharges, PPE, we very fortunate that we've had no issues with PPE, and also the social distancing. So where we, would have had 4 or 5 patients on a vehicle at once, clearly, working with our staff side, health and safety risk department and our head of IP&C, putting risk assessments together to ensure that the safety of our patients and our staff with the social distancing. Next slide, please. In terms of maximising our resource to protect both the front line and our absolute essential services, given the abstraction rates that we were faced with, so we trained 76 university year 1 graduates, and they're working alongside qualified members of staff both on PTS and high dependency. And then we also upskilled 156 PTS staff as well and implemented a high dependency tier. Some of those included our bank staff, where they've asked to take permanent contracts for the period of the COVID and upskilled as well. And they work alongside our frontline service. And also we contacted our recent retirees, and we also had some success where they came back to work as well for us. Next slide, please. So in communication, this was absolutely vital, as I alluded to earlier. So we started off where PTS weren't transporting COVID suspected or positive patients, and very, very quickly the guidance was changing, keeping on top of the national guidance, PHE guidance. So we really needed to make sure that we're communicating to all of our staff. We did that through a number of routes really. We have plasma screens on our stations, we have 7-day management cover, operational clinical notices. Staff were anxious about the application of PPE, so our training school, we made a video for them that was available. We downloaded it onto YouTube, on the plasma screens in the stations, and actually it was just about making sure that there was that contact with the managers 7 days a week. From a command perspective, so command and control, full command control has been in place, daily meetings chaired by our Chief Executive Anthony Marsh, and then I've also held daily meetings, or sometimes twice, 3 times meetings with my senior management team as well. Next slide, please. PPE, as I've alluded to, really good stock. We've been doing daily count, daily deliveries, and we've been able to provide to staff, patients and taxis and volunteer car drivers as well. Next slide, please. Partnership working, so we pride ourselves with working with our partners, our acute trust community, and also our commissioners. We also were involved in the Nightingale Hospital, and we had dedicated discharge coordinators on site there and managers overseeing that. And then also as well, we had COVID testing, so at the Resorts World Arena we had a COVID testing pod, and then we also had hot hubs in Coventry and Warwickshire that we got involved with. Next slide, please. Really important, staff health and wellbeing, massive change for PTS staff, as are obviously from a clinical perspective, paramedics as well. Gone from hardly ever wearing PPE to wearing it for every patient. Mental health support's been absolutely key to our staff. We've given booklets and also welfare checks, for those staff shielding, working from home. We've done BME risk assessments, antigen testings, and also the staff swab testings, and we've been doing those knows both where they've gone into a testing centre, or we've been doing that mobile as well, also reaching out to those areas, you know, that aren't within the West Midlands, so Cheshire as well, home visits, so not disadvantaging anybody at all. Tea, coffees, treats.
Sorry, Michelle.
Thank you. Tea, coffees and treats we've provided. And then in terms of trying to, you know, maximise social distances, the Trust purchased additional picnic tables as well for staff. Next slide, please. So I just want to say a massive thank you. I think in terms of from our, a West Midlands perspective, you know, we've worked really, really well with our acute trusts, our commissioners, you know, and, you know, the staff have really, really risen to the challenge. There has been some anxieties, and there will be again, you know, PTS as we move into stage 2 as well. Who knows what that'll look like, but I'm confident that the relationship that we've got will just build in, and, you know, that will grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And to Michelle and all our speakers, there's quite a lot of chat generating now, and for other people, it's worth just watching that through. So if people can contribute, that's great. So I'm now going to hand over to John, who's joined us from Northampton CCG. If you could put your camera and come off mute, John, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, yes, thanks very much for inviting me along today. Yeah, I want to talk. I want to talk today about harnessing the positives. I think all too often we do talk about the negatives in PTS or from PTS experiences. So this is just a view from our experiences in Northamptonshire over recent months. I hope some of you will have experienced some positives or some similar positives to what we have during this pandemic. Certainly listening to Michelle's presentation then, and also David's earlier, I think there's some similar themes, so that is positive in itself. So next slide, please. I'm pretty sure that some of you will be familiar with a term used within the world of PTS, particularly the providers amongst us, being called the Cinderella service, or termed the Cinderella service, purely for the reason that it's the last thing to be thought about, and it's all too often the case. We continue to see that as being the case. Next service, please. Sorry, next slide, please. So someone who has experienced many sides of PTS within the service itself, from commissioning, contract management, from an acute perspective, when acutes and provider trusts were commissioning it, more recently within the CCG, and also within the service itself. I continue to be frustrated with the challenges that make commissioning and managing a quality, an efficient and economical and viable service possible. So I've listed some of those here. I'm sure some of you will be wholly familiar with these. So the first one I've got is ring fencing and conflicting priorities, or if you like, working in silos. Despite having the same aim, being the patient, different organisations, trusts, departments, they all have their own priorities, all have their own targets, and as such it's rare for each of the silos to work together to understand each other's pressures, and then come together to create a process that works for all, and in turn improve that patient experience. In my own experience, the best example today is working with renal services, but we keep trying. I'll pick a couple of these out, last to be thought of. Only last week I was party to a discussion about capacity in acute operations, where the front door 111s, 909s were discussed, but there's very little discussion about PTS at the back door, and I think that's still concerning that is the case. Cross-border, current commissioning framework makes it very disjointed, inefficient, uneconomical, and extremely operationally challenging. Unrealistic expectations. I'm sure we've all experienced the stretcher booking that landed half an hour before the care home, which is 5 miles away, closes its doors. So it goes without saying that the focus goes on the challenges and the negatives so much that we often forget to embrace and harness the positives when they present to us. So I just wanted to really put on screen that we've had some in Northampton over recent months, and I just wanted to put them on screen. Next slide, please. So some of the positives, I see them as a breakthrough that we've seen since the pandemic forced formation of what I'd call a more collaborative approach across our system. There's been a slow retreat of barriers. It didn't happen overnight, but certainly within the various trusts and departments and so forth, the barriers have receded and people have worked better together. It's improved communication wholly. Again, it hasn't happened overnight, but there's been a certain improved communication as the pandemic has progressed. Working towards the same aim, it goes without saying that this is a time with clear understanding of what everyone needs to achieve. And I think another one, and Michelle touched on it in her presentation, that is the staff and staff motivation. We've seen staff step up to the challenge. There's been a desire to be part of the response. And I think that's excellent. I think it's great for PTS staff. And it's something we need to harness and take forward. Next slide, please. Again, as already has been alluded to, now is even more important than ever to harness the positives of we do have major challenges ahead of us. Arguably more demand for services with less resources due to social distancing, the unknown with more virtual appointments in the offing. Modelling is going to be extremely difficult. Thank you. More time critical appointments due to the need for improved flow of patients because of social distancing. Shielding family members means there's likely going to be more requests for PTS, and winter and the pandemic also still ahead of us and going to be a major challenge. Next slide, please. So we've had some wins in the past, but we've also seen many of those fall by the wayside when the going gets tough, mainly in the winter. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with this type of approach that you can see on the screen now. I'm not looking at reinventing the wheel, but I am interested in keeping things simple. So this is a methodology that we are adapting as we wash up, take stock, and plan to execute restoration and look at the future of PTS in Northamptonshire. Next slide, please. Thank you. Happy to take any questions as already discussed.
That's lovely. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass straight over to Paul Devlin, who's joined us from ECIST and is going to talk about resilience and retention of staff within PTS services. So thanks, Paul. You can turn your camera on and come off mute.
Thanks, Charlotte and Jen, for the opportunity to come and just present this little concept we've got here at ECIST to you guys today. It's a pleasure to be with you. Just do a sound check. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're fine, Paul.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. So next slide, please. I'm going to talk to you about a very simple concept just for a few minutes, and it's based on some work we've been looking at in terms of if we're truly committed to provide the kind of service we would want for ourselves and our family, what would we need to do to create the environment, if you like, for our team to perform at their best? And if you read some of the stuff around Google Perfect Team, they ask the same question: how could they be the best organisation in the world and ultimately be the Google Perfect Team? And the answer was surprising. It came back and it was basically saying you need to create a positive and supportive environment where your people can come to work and be at their best. So what we've done is create a concept called NHS Great Place to Work, and it's also available to third-party providers that are supporting the NHS to deliver core services. And the concept goes like this, very briefly. We'll all be familiar with people that are stuck in jobs that they don't like. They're not valued by their managers, and they're probably frightened or for one reason or another unable to leave. But we've got to ask ourselves this question: how likely are they to provide the kind of quality that we want from our organisation? And the answer is, of course, not very likely. And then on the flip side of that coin, you've got some people that are in jobs that they love. They're working for people that really, truly value them. And those people genuinely look forward to coming to work. Now, we ask ourselves the same question: how likely are they to provide excellent care or service? And the answer is far more likely. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the concept in terms of the work that Simon Sinek did around creating a compelling why for what we do, before how we say what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So our compelling why for this work is we believe that every patient and service user deserves a quality of care that we'd expect for ourselves and our family. Now, that might not be always a reality or always possible, but we should be striving to meet that standard, because as we heard earlier in the week on some of the other sessions, there's very often a parallel quality of service provision running. It's the quality of care or service that members of the NHS or people that support the NHS require when they're service users. And then there's a quality of service that we routinely provide through our contracts or through our normal encounters with patients. So for that to happen, we've got to create a really positive and supportive environment where our teams can be at their best. And that's not just they can provide great service when they come to work for us, but as employers, they want to come to work for us because they know that we will help them reach their true potential and flourish. Next slide, please. So I just wanted you to have a look at a few of the little statistics around some of the research that we've been looking into, and I'm not going to go through all of these in detail at all, but suffice to say, if we ignore the kind of strapline around benefits of being happy in the workplace, if anybody came to us with a business case to say, I'm going to reduce your sickness, your short-term sickness by 90%, I'm going to double your productivity, I'm going to double your resilience, I'm going to make your people more promotable and aspirational in their work, and you're going to retain them for twice as long. And not only that, they're going to pitch up and show up in a way that most people would never do that. They're going to be 6 times more energized. There's about 430,000 people involved in that research, and that was the kind of outcomes that people were finding. If we can create an environment where our teams are genuinely valued and they look forward to coming to work. So for us, NHS Great Place to Work is a bit of a no-brainer. Next slide, please. So just briefly to flag with you the concept of incivility. It's something we're majoring on now, and I know Charlotte and the team kind of featured this in our winter planning sessions over the last year or two. But the impact on people and how we treat each other at work is absolutely devastating. It's dramatic. And incivility, if we tolerate incivility, we kind of experience all these really negative kind of concepts, not just on us as individuals, but on our fellow employees, but also on onlookers when we interact with other services in the community and other hospital sites or whatever, clinics, but also on patients and their relatives. So incivility needs to be hunted out and dealt with. Next slide, please. So basically, how does it all work? Well, it's really, really simple. So it can work at any level of your organisation. It can work on a single team basis, or it can work on an organisational level basis. And we ask 2 questions, and this is basically it. On a scale of 1 to 10, how great is it to work here? And the second question is, if it's not a 10, what do we need to do to make it a 10? And then obviously the focus is on then forming groups who can actually go and use rapid improvement processes to tackle the key things to prevent your staff saying it's a 10 to work here. And then we plot the distribution in terms of how many people say what score they think it is. And then all the feedback around what we need to do to make it a 10 is themes. And then we obviously address the key things that most people are saying is causing them a problem they're worried about first. There is no other questions than that. And the responses are wide and varied. It can be anything from I don't feel valued to I haven't got the equipment to do my job, or I'm being bullied, or some of the kind of concepts here, I don't feel supported by my manager. So it's just an offer from us at ECIST, guys, to yourselves. If anybody would like to test out Great Place to Work, I think what we've seen, the link to the quality of service you provide and the way your staff feel about working for you and the experience your service users get is absolutely inexplicably linked. It's a little concept. So if anybody likes to go, then please by all means get in touch and I'll be happy to facilitate it. And finally, I'll close on this. God forbid anybody on this call today needed an emergency ambulance crew for a member of themselves or their family. How do you feel? How would you feel in terms of the quality that one of these guys would provide if they came out to you on 999? How likely would it be for you to get a high quality and emergency service from any one of these guys? Each one of these guys now is physically off the ground saying, bring it on, I'm ready for the day, and I'm going to do an absolutely fantastic job. So with that slide, guys, I'm going to say, Great Place to Work's out there for you. Please get in touch if you want to give it a go. Charlotte, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And I've just popped in the chat. If you let Jenny know if anyone's interested, we'll be able to sort that out with Paul for you. So
Brilliant.
I'm going to quickly
Thanks, guys.
run tight on time, so I'm going to pass you over to Claire from the CQC. So Claire, if you can come off mute and put your camera on, that would be lovely. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much. If you go on to the next slide, please. So I thought it would be useful to give you a sort of a bit of a context of where CQC were pre-COVID-19 in terms of patient transport services and our inspections of ambulance services. We've been carrying out routine inspections of NHS trusts, including ambulance trusts, for some time, and our ratings, we've got 1 outstanding, 8 good, and 1 requires improvement NHS ambulance trusts. We'd completed the first round of inspections of independent ambulance services, and at that time we didn't have the legal powers to rate those services. So at the end of that inspection round, we published a state of care into independent ambulance services, and that was in March 2019. I think it's important to say before I move on to some of the sort of more negative findings from that first round of inspections that there clearly are a lot of good providers in the sector, but the sector as a whole does have some challenges, and I'm just going to run through some of those overarching findings. So firstly was around robust recruitment, which we often found was lacking, and many providers didn't realise the importance of ensuring that they have appropriate recruitment practices in place. Staffing checks were often enforced inconsistently, including quite basic things like DBS, driving licence, photo identification, for example. And many independent services believed that their responsibility was discharged by the NHS, particularly in relation to safeguarding checks. Training also varied hugely, particularly training for driving under blue lights in the emergency sector. And again, there was a presumption that training received by staff elsewhere could be transferred to an independent provider. And there were delays in making safeguarding notifications, again, because they didn't necessarily understand, even if they were delivering services on behalf of an NHS trust, that they themselves needed to have processes in place to alert local authorities. There were also some issues around availability and maintenance of vehicles and equipment, and some particular concern about caring for patients with mental health needs. And overall, in terms of governance and risk management, we found that many providers just didn't really understand what it means to be a regulated organisation and the requirements placed upon them. And we stated that better commissioning and contract monitoring is required to make sure that the right provider is selected to transport patients, with the view that that's often driven by financial reasons without due regard given to the ability of the provider to actually operate a safe and high quality service. And that those providers, if they were unable to fulfil the contractual obligations, they may then subcontract to another organisation, and each time there was a subcontracted element, it added further risk, and there have been instances where unregistered providers have been used. The other main findings from the state of care were actually around the unregulated sector. So for those of you who are unaware, any services, medical services or transport services provided on an event site are not within CQC's scope of regulation. We have no remit over them. And in terms of PTS specifically, the regulated activity that determines what is in and out of our scope, is based on the vehicle design rather than the needs of the patient being transported. So we were raising some concerns about those particular areas of the unregulated sector. If you go on to the next slide, please. So what were we doing to address these concerns? Well, we started another programme of inspection of independent services, and this time we do have the power to rate. Our current ratings profile based on 116 locations is 11% inadequate, 34% RI, 53% good and 3% outstanding. We've got a couple of air ambulances, but I think also actually one land ambulance in the independent sector rated as outstanding. And that is quite an unusual ratings profile. Normally you'd be looking at maybe 2% inadequate. So it is a not as a favourable ratings profile as other types of sectors that we regulate. We were also looking to strengthen our assessment of how well NHS trusts manage their subcontracting arrangements, and that's not only the NHS Ambulance Trust but also other types of trusts, acute mental health trusts, who will often commission directly with private providers to carry out some of their transporting. And we were raising our concerns about that unregulated sector with a range of stakeholders. At one point, we were expecting the regulations to be updated with the view that hopefully we would be able to bring some of those providers that are out of scope into our scope. But as with many things at the moment, that's now been put on hold. But we have been speaking with a range of other bodies in the sector, the Events Industry Forum and the National Police Chiefs Council, local authorities, to let them know that there is a gap here in terms of regulation and to raise awareness of our concerns. If you go on to the next slide, please. So then in terms of, well, COVID-19 hits, what's the impact that we can see, particularly on the patient transport sector? So some overarching issues, NHS and CCG contract monitoring may be further reduced given everything else that's going on, and there's a risk that quality and safety standards won't be maintained. And we've got particular concerns where procurement is via e-portals. There is a lot of confusion, I think it's fair to say, as to what exactly the e-portals do, with some believing that the e-portal themselves carries out assurance checks of providers and such, when actually that isn't the case. They at best may spot check a small percentage of providers at a very basic level in terms of asking for policy to be submitted, etc. So it's really key that those who are using the e-portals understand, therefore, that the process of assuring those providers falls to them. I've spoken a little bit about the event-only provision being out of our scope, and of course events aren't happening now, so we started to see a number of event-only providers starting to provide regulated activity. Again, they may not understand the regulatory requirements, and they may not understand that legally they have to be registered with CQC in order to carry out that activity. Previous speakers have spoken about high demand, and the need for social distancing might mean that PTS is being undertaken in a range of vehicles which may not have been primarily designed for that purpose, and therefore again we'll have individual vehicles where journeys undertaken in those wouldn't actually be within CQC's scope of regulation. And lastly, that providers may not be plugged into NHS comms, and so that should say may not be operating to latest guidance and protocols. And I did see on the comments pane that there were some private providers saying that they'd struggled to gain traction within NHS trusts. So that was interesting to see. And if you can move on to the next slide, please. And then in terms of exacerbation of existing risks, well, I've spoken about recruitment and staffing issues. So, we may have services waiving robust recruitment checks in order to try and increase their staffing resources. We've had a relaxation of rules around DBS, which could allow unsuitable individuals to access patients, and we have particular concerns around individuals who have had allegations of sexual assault against them, and examples of where those individuals have been able to work within services. And of course, again, as others spoken to, we might have workforce who are often substantively employed elsewhere, and so there are both cross-infection and well-being risks there. The pressures that the pressures that you're under could impact on availability of training, And we think that the independent sector in particular may have reduced access to external services such as deep cleaning, vehicle maintenance, etc. And suboptimal IPC procedures were another concern that we had prior to COVID-19. And if you could just move on to the last slide, this is just a couple of screenshots from social media that we've seen of recruitment ads. So this isn't necessarily registered providers finding this. It might be people who are acting like an agency. The one on the left, I think, was posted just before midnight, wanting people to work the next day. So, you know, how can they be carrying out appropriate recruitment checks there? And the one on the right again, offering services and saying at the bottom, we're not currently CQC registered, but we have policies and procedures in place, or they may be able to operate under existing companies, CQC registered companies, which is, you know, that's a bit of a warning sign for us. As I say, they do need to be legally registered. So yeah, just it was useful to share a couple of those with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. And I'm going to very quickly hand over to Chris, who went last for us last week as well. So Chris, over to you. Just take the time out. I won't sum up at the end unless we can. Thank you.
No problem, Charlotte. It's okay. I can go through these. So thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Green. I'm the Head of Informatics for the Emergency Care Improvement Support Team at NHS England and Improvement. So I think it's been fantastic to hear about so many organisations and what they've been doing during this time period. What I want to do is kind of bring it back to some of the evidence behind this. So it's great to hear about the anecdote about what you are doing and living and breathing going through this situation. But actually, sometimes we do need to have the evidence behind it. So I'll be going through some of those things. So Chris, can we go to the next slide, please? So we're in unprecedented times, both in terms of operational pressure, the clinical, what we're seeing, but also in terms of the data, okay, so to a lesser point, but we've never seen such variation in terms of data. But it doesn't just happen, okay? Attendances don't just go down, occupied beds don't just go down. It's for a particular reason, and we've seen a real significant reduction in many areas, but kind of the three areas that we're going to be looking about today are attendances to the emergency department and the variation that we've seen in both walk-ins and ambulances. We'll also have a look at the reduction in occupied beds, and we'll also have a look at handovers as well. The next slide, please, Chris, has a look at A&E data and the flow of patients going through the emergency department and the acute setting. This is from the ECIST dashboard that comes out on a daily basis, goes out to about 3,000 people. It provides a real clear overview in terms of urgent emergency care metrics. And it doesn't just look at point prevalence studies, but it actually uses tried and tested statistical techniques to identify areas of interest and concern so that we can have a look at something and understand whether we should investigate this in more detail. So if we just go on to the next slide, please. What I want to just kind of illustrate to you is the amount of reduction that we have seen in both walk-ins and ambulance attendances. The vast majority of the reduction in overall attendances has been through walk-ins, and we can see that on this time series slide. It goes back to late February, and we can see that when lockdown started, or just prior to that, around the 23rd of March, we did start to see a significant reduction in walk-in attendances. The interesting one, though, for me is the red line, is that ambulance attendances, yes, they did decline, but nowhere near in terms of the amount of patients that didn't come to the emergency departments under their own steam. But if we can have a look at the next slide, please, Chris. What I want to show you is that it doesn't just happen and it doesn't stay there for very long. So a lot of people were talking about the new normal, and the new normal in terms of activity levels, and we've heard that through some of the sessions this afternoon. But I think the interesting one for me is about how much the new normal is going back to the old normal very quickly. So if we just focus on these four metrics, attendances, total, ambulances, type 1 and occupied beds, take the baseline position of February, and the reason why we take February as a baseline position is that that was the last full month of quote unquote normal data. But what we can see is that in April, and if we'll have a look over on the left-hand side at attendances, in April, attendances dropped down to about 50% of their normal levels. In May, it went up to 62%, and in last week, it was up to 70%. whereas attendances only, quote unquote, drop down to 75%, but are already back up to 85% of their normal levels. Attendances are going back up significantly, and interestingly so are occupied beds. So yes, they drop down to 57% of normal variation, but actually it's starting to go back up incredibly quickly. But interestingly, there's also variation within that detail as well. If we just go on to the next slide, please, Chris. We can have a look at the, we'll go on to the next slide as well, please. Just conscious of time. So this scatter plot shows every grade dot is every trust in the country. This takes a baseline position of February and compares it to the most recent data we have to have a look at, well, does it matter that attendances have dropped? Well, actually, a really interesting point for me is that attendances have little correlation with overall beds occupied. But if we go on to the next slide, please, Chris, what we can really see is there is an awful lot of variation in terms of how much patient trusts have been able to reduce their long lengths of stay patients. So you can see on the x-axis that some trusts have been able to reduce their long lengths of stay patients by 60, 70, 80%, whereas some organisations have actually seen a marginal increase. And what we're using this on the national discharge cell that I was on yesterday was really to identify the organisations that have made significant variation, significant change, and understanding exactly what they've done, how they've done it, and why they've done it. And some of the talks this afternoon have really provided some fantastic clarity and detail about what you've done, and we really want to hear from you and learn how we can take that forward into the next few months. So thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed that. It's been a fantastic session, and thanks very much for Charlotte and Chris for coordinating it, administrating it. I'll pass over back to Charlotte.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for bringing us in almost bang on time. We're getting better as these events are going on. Just a huge, massive thank you to all of those speakers. That was an incredible selection we've had right from across voluntary, national, public, private, everything. So absolutely fabulous, and thank you so much. The chat's been extraordinary. I think there is clearly something, and I will consider how we do this with the national team, about actually getting some sort of forum type model in place for PTS providers. It's clear that there's a bit of a gap from the things that people are saying. I hope you found the lessons that have been presented really helpful. We will share with you the slides along with the question and answer sheet from today's session. And if there's anything particular that you want, you've got Jenny's email, so please just drop her a line. And with only 2 minutes over, which is a record for us, thank you very, very much for your time. Take care.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys.